The history of the town of Cass, named for Joseph K. Cass, chairman of the board of West Virginia Pulp and Paper, follows the evolution of the lumber companies that inhabited the Greenbrier Valley and operated the West Virginia Pulp and Paper Mill. Once a symbol of the economic power that drove this valley, the mill building has been a victim of two major fires, in 1973 and again in 1982. Now, only twisted steel and rusted machinery remain. Trees and vines now grow in place of where humans once toiled among the machines that manufactured lumber and fine wood products. During its heyday from 1908 to 1922, the mill operation was enormous. At its peak, West Virginia Pulp and Paper employed between 2,500 and 3,000 skilled workers. The ruined mill is now a symbol and a reminder of the past. But the story of the mill is also a story of the rails and of the steam locomotives that linked that mill with the timber in the nearby mountains. In 1901, a railroad was built to haul the massive amount of maple, cherry, birch, and oak timber from the mountains to the mill. Eventually, 250 miles of track were built to carry the timber from mountain to town. But over the years, the timber industry in West Virginia went into slow decline, and the railroad and the mill were finally shut down in 1960. However, in 1963, the West Virginia State Legislature decided the story of Cass was worth preserving and passed a bill bringing the town and the railroad into the state park system. Since that time, the Cass Scenic Railroad has been transformed from a tired, worn-out, and about-to-be-scrapped logging railroad into a first-rate living museum.
Well, I've lived here all my life. Well, the only thing, I used to get on the log train and ride up the mountain and watch the skidders work up there. So I got to see all that, and I had brothers, worked for them. I was just getting old enough to start to work for the lumber company when they closed down, so I missed out on that. In 1963, when the state bought the railroad, I went to work for them, and I worked 50 years on the railroad for them.
The guys up here are very good at their job. It's a dying breed because you just can't go somewhere else like that and get a job. Of course, Lima Locomotives no longer is in operation. The building doesn't even exist anymore, and that's where all of our engines came from. All Shays were built in Lima, Ohio. They know what they're doing, but it's one of those jobs that you have to pass down to the younger generation. We have one engineer that's been here for 42 years. He grew up right here in this town. Bud, he's been here forever. He's had every job that there is to have.
Well, when I worked on the railroad, I done it all. I started out repairing track, and then I went to braking on the train. After that, I went to firing the engine, and then after that, I went to engineer, and after that, I went to conductor.
Cass is one of those places that there is no other place like Cass. The engine that came in a little while ago, the Shay 5, that's the oldest operating Shay engine in the world, still in the same track that it was built for. It came here directly out of the factory in Lima, Ohio, November 1st, 1905. And it's never left this operation. There's no other Shay engine in the world that has that claim to it. We also have the largest existing Shay engine in the world. It weighs 162 tons. It was also the very last Shay engine that they built. And they only used that engine for 4 years for doing its actual work. It was built for the coal company up in Chaffee, Maryland. And it was for a high seam of coal. Diesels cannot go up a high seam of coal. They can only do flat stuff. So they came down here, did blueprints from one of our big Shays, took it back to Lima and built this big engine that we have. It's called Western Maryland Shay 6. That's also the largest one in existence now. Weighs 162 tons, and it was built in 1945, and they never made another Shay.
But they're just set up in, the gears are different on each one of them. You have the Shay that's geared down the side. The Heisler is like a V8 engine down the center, and the Climax sits parallel with the track. So that's the only difference, but they're all practically works on the same system.
So you can't, if you're a steam fan, you can't go anywhere else and get what we have here. We have all three different types of steam geared logging locomotives here. And once the Climax is out on track, it's being restored right now. As far as I know, Cass will be the only place that has all three different types of steam geared logging locomotives in operation. I started out working for the state of West Virginia for the state park system, but I worked out of the depot doing information. And then I went to work up at the company store, and I worked in the company store, which was really cool.
Well, as a young girl, we used to come in here, and it was a very great place to visit. They had everything you wanted. When you first came in, there was a counter here that all girls liked to look at because it had jewelry in it. So we would look at the jewelry. The other thing, we went to school at Cass Grade School, and that we would get on our lunch hour. We would run from grade school out here to get an ice cream cone at the soda fountain and then go back to school. So there's a lot of memories here. Got clothes here, toys, Christmas toys, groceries. The other side over there was a market that you could buy groceries. Upstairs on the second floor was furniture. We got our first television set here. The third floor, we never were allowed to go up on the third floor, so I have no idea what was there. My grandfather worked at the mill. My other grandfather worked on the mountain. My dad worked at the mill and then left and went to Maryland. But at the time it was closing, when the mill was closing. He came back and opened up the Cass Historical Museum. It opened in '63. It was a historical museum at that time with Civil War things. In 1975, he opened up the museum, which is there now, with all the history pertaining to Cass.
We restore the houses as we get funds to do it. We rent out 20, but there are a lot more on site that we have not finished restoring yet. And we just get them restored as much as we can. But the houses we started building them in 1901, and they weren't meant to last. They were meant to last only as long as the timber did. But here we are in 2016, and they're still here. And we get a lot of people come back that were raised here, born here, and they always want to stay in the house that they grew up in. And there's been a lot of families lived in the same house, so it's always a challenge sometimes, especially during homecoming week, to get the same, to get your house. So they have to rent that house normally about a year ahead of time. But everything here in town is original except for a couple buildings. I always like to tell people we're not built to look old. We're just old. This house behind us is my favorite house in town. The house it's called the Luke House. Some locals refer to it as the Clubhouse also. It was built in 1918 by Charles Luke and for his wife as a summer residence. In all areas that there is a West Virginia pulp and paper or a Westvaco plant, there is a Luke House. This is the only Luke House that has never been privately owned. This one started out as West Virginia Pulp and Paper, and then it was sold to the Maurer Lumber Company whenever they bought the whole paper mill, and then the state of West Virginia whenever it became a state park. So it's never been privately owned. So it's basically like it was whenever Charles Luke built it in 1918.